Thanks for joining us. How serious is Coal and Allied about the closure of some Hunter Valley mines, in particular West Wallsend number 2, Stockington number 2 and the Wallsend borehole?
Well, Coal and Allied is extremely serious. We have a long established record of never threatening closure. It's our policy to run mines whilever we can viably do so. We wouldn't threaten closure. We would only be in the present position if we'd been taken to the point where closure was inevitable.
How profitable are those mines? Are they making any money at all?
The mines that are under closure threat now are not making any money at all. In fact, have lost substantial amounts of money since the 1st of July last.
Why can BHP claim that it can make West Wallsend viable and Coal and Allied wants to sell it if it's making such a loss?
Oh, it's a simple matter of geography and logistics, that we're simply crippled by the transportation cost and the coal preparation process having to take place remote from the site.
As a coal miner, labour's just one of your costs. The mining unions say that you've been going after them with big sticks over the last couple of months and that there are other areas that perhaps could be looked at more seriously. Do you agree with that?
I think the thrust that the unions have been on has been that we could obtain more from our overseas customers for the coal than we do. They have made a very big fuss about the $2.90 price increase that the hard coking coal suppliers got with Japan, and it was generally anticipated that they may have done better. As far as the soft coking coal that we produce is concerned, and we're not involved at all with hard coking coal, we achieved increases of US $3.40 and US $3.90 respectively for the two grades of soft coking coal we supply. That is precisely in accordance with the market expectation. But let me give you an example. If we achieve, Coal and Allied puts something like 10 million tonnes per annum into the marketplace. If we achieve an extra $2 a tonne by a more successful price negotiation, that would increase our revenue by $20 million. Since the 1st of July last, industrial stoppage has cost our company something like 2 million tonnes, which at a round figure price of $50 a tonne free on board ship in Newcastle has cost the company revenue of $100 million.
So strikes are costing you more than the apparent cut in the price rise?
Exactly.
Once you close a mine, the risk is you lose a skilled workforce. That must be quite a concern.
It's for this very reason that we've sustained the losses we have for so long. There is no mining industry in the world that equips its mines as we've equipped our mines to work them for as short a time in the year. And this is the kind of thing that we've been hopeful of working through. Now, the thing that has dawned on us with the union's rejection of the Coal Industry Tribunal's decision in respect of the transfer of labour with the West Wallsend sale is that if the unions won't accept that kind of change, I don't believe there's any hope of them accepting the more significant changes that need to be accepted if this industry is to be efficient by world standards. I still find it extremely difficult to understand how the whole of the district could take 24 hours off to vote on a decision that really affects the employment at 3 mines. It's, to me, it's a large group of people agreeing or voting at a meeting to fight to the last drop of someone else's blood.
Mr. Thomson, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
System to education.
The proposal being championed by Prime Minister Hawke is for graduates to repay part of their education costs through a tax surcharge. Mr Brown, who's chairman of caucus, says such a system discriminates against university graduates. He says it's like asking the unemployed to repay the dole when they get a job.
We abolished university fees and we threw the doors of the universities and the institutes of higher education open to all people. Now, I'm not in favour of turning my back on that, and I hope my colleagues won't do it either.
there are ways
in the centre of Sydney, a demolition worker was killed when a front-end loader crashed 13 floors to the base of the old MBF building. The man killed was not involved in the fall. He was working on the ground floor when he was hit by the tangle of rubble and machinery from above. Amazingly, the operator who'd been working on the roof just hung onto his machine's controls and escaped serious injury. Also in Sydney, a proposal to allow some pubs and clubs to stay open 24 hours a day. The idea is to make overseas visitors, who are accustomed to getting a drink whenever they want, feel more at home. Apparently it will only be those pubs with a tourist clientele likely to be considered for extended hours.
Ball out this time for Davidson.
And probably drowning their sorrows right now are the mighty Blues. In the State of Origin game in Sydney tonight, Queensland beat New South Wales 26-18. Queensland was playing without the great Wally Lewis. He's got a shoulder injury. The experts' verdict on the game, Queensland was clearly the better side on the night, despite a face-saving last-minute try by the Blues.
Oh, that's a try! That's a face-saver! Mark Bedore rewarded with a Blues try, right on the bell. 12 seconds remaining.
The National Safety Council sees relocation of its maritime headquarters to Newcastle as a natural extension of a foothold already established here. Last year, the Victorian branch of the council won a search and rescue contract with RAF Base Williamtown. A helicopter, rescue boat and fixed-wing aircraft were all based here to meet that commitment. If the Maritime Division moves to Newcastle, that equipment will be reinforced with several inflatable rescue boats, a training ketch, a yacht, and the pride of the fleet, the Blue Nabilla, a 35-metre vessel equipped with everything from sophisticated sonar to a helicopter landing pad. Safety Council Public Affairs Manager Bruce Savage sees Newcastle as an ideal site.
The National Safety Council has quite a sizable maritime division around Australia. At the moment it's based at Port Welshpool in Bass Strait in Victoria. What we're trying to do is to rationalise by putting that base in a more central location along the eastern seaboard of Australia, and that's why Newcastle, with the facilities that it does have already, is most attractive.
The Victorian Division of the National Safety Council is one branch of an organisation with independent non-profit operations in each state. But the Victorians alone have grown into a massive operation with a $60 million a year turnover, offering specialised services and equipment throughout Australia and overseas in China, France, Canada and Spain. Bruce Savage attributes that phenomenal expansion to foresight.
It's quite simple really. The NSCA in Victoria for some 60 years has been operating as a safety consultancy organisation, like other divisions in every other state of Australia. However, the Victorian division saw about 12 years ago that there were areas of expertise that were required within Australia and weren't being covered, and those included search and rescue, hyperbaric retrievals, remote sensing, ambulance work and so on. So we've developed that expertise, and now there is quite a large demand nationally and internationally for that work.
To appreciate the scale of the Victorian operation, you must go to their headquarters. This is the National Safety Council base at West Sale. It's the headquarters of the Victorian Division, a self-contained village of 200 administrators, technicians and engineers. It's also where the proposal to build a maritime base at Newcastle was first considered.
Operations.
The base is equipped for self-sufficiency. Everything is done here, from maintaining a fleet of rescue helicopters to designing and tailoring uniforms and webbing. Equipment on standby gives an indication of the range of services provided. This electric-powered submersible and recompression chamber will be attached to the maritime section in Newcastle. West Sale serves as command centre for all operations. Newcastle would be in constant contact, backed up by facilities such as the remote sensing section, which can accurately plot from high altitude the movement of an oil slick or a bushfire. That specialisation has won the council an impressive clientele.
Well, some of the bigger ones that we have are obviously SOBHP, the Australian paper mills, a lot of other multinationals, some government departments like the Department of Transport and Communications and Sea Safety, the statutory authorities in each state like the police, So we do have a wide-ranging number of clients in private enterprise and government.
With relocation of the Maritime Division, that list is likely to grow, not only strengthening the Safety Council, but also boosting Newcastle's prestige as premier port in the state.
When Tom Moore, Nicholas Watkins and Alan Westbury hadn't reached their destination in the Waddingham Forest by Saturday night, their venturer leader, Greg Jackson, knew something was up. The boys were experienced bushwalkers. Early fears were held that one of them had been injured on the trip, which should have been an easy 4-hour trek. But it was 2 days later before the boys were winched out of the bush back to safety. As the shivering teenagers sat pondering their experience, they were oblivious to the series of mishaps which plagued the operation.
This was just a training camp. Next week we've got the main one.
Big one. Will you be going?
Oh yeah, I think so.
On Sunday night, 2 ground parties left from opposite ends of the trail. Dressed only in walking clothes and not as well as equipped as the scouts they were hoping to rescue, one of the search parties became stranded in the bush. Beaten by the night, they were forced to spend it with no food, tents or sleeping bags. That party was picked up the next day by 4-wheel drive. And the rescue helicopter, which spotted the boys' torches on Sunday evening, also hit a few snags. After dropping supplies and a message to the scouts, the helicopter returned the next morning to winch them out. But as the last boy ascended to the safety of the cockpit, the winch became stuck, leaving yet another rescuer stranded in the dense bush.
When we started to deliver their gear up, we found that because of the way that the cable was tied, we ended up with a swivel brake, and what that virtually means was that the cable unravelled, which meant then that we were unable to use, or we weren't prepared to use, the winch cable to retrieve our rescue crewmen.
The chopper came back for crewman Bob Jenkins with a 30-metre length of rope. Hovering precariously close to the treetops, the rope was lowered to Jenkins, who tied the best knot of his life. He then took off for what will surely be the ride of his life. After what must have seemed like an eternity, he was lowered to the ground for a more conventional ride home.
To look down, it's a long way down to fall. If something goes wrong.
You willing to do it again?
Oh, next year. Not every day, that's for sure.
Oh, you missed
the story had a happy ending. The boys are now safe and well, planning their next trip. But the rescuers found the going tough, and at times becoming the rescue. All this just weeks after a similar incident involving casual bushwalkers using the Waddingham trails. But the boys' venturer leader, Greg Jackson, at the end of the ordeal, had harsh criticism for poor signposting and trail maintenance by the National Parks and Wildlife Service.
To have a look at the literature that's put out on the tracks, you'd say yes, it's an easy track, and coming from Maclean's in, they have a sign to say it's 4 hours, fairly difficult walk, but a 4 hours walk, and they even say children can be taken on and supervised. So to look at that, you'd say this track's still okay, so maybe there needs some work to be done on it.
The dust mite is an invisible house guest, usually in carpets and blankets, but a microscope can find thousands of them in one bed. Those mites often bring on hay fever, eczema and asthma attacks. Today, researchers at Sydney University announced a discovery that could relieve the problem. Alisearch, a non-toxic household spray.
The mite is killed and the substance that causes the allergy is destroyed.
The spray was developed over 4 years, made from leaves which have their own protection against mites. The idea is to spray where mites live, and recent tests have shown it gives some relief without side effects. Most of the work has been done with asthmatics because nearly all sufferers have a reaction to dust mites. With asthma killing around 15 Australians each week, the product is promising.
If we can reduce the morbidity, that is the severity of asthma, then we're going to save lives. And I think this is one of the ways we can go towards reducing the severity of asthma.
The development is a world first, and the university is sure there will be an export market. There'll also be royalties for more research. A commercial company is now making the spray, which could also neutralise pollens and other allergic dusts. There'll be more studies in the next 3 months, and for those who want to spray their beds, the product will be on sale early next year.
Less than 6 kilometres from the Melbourne GPO and in the shadow of the Westgate Bridge, the birds are returning. Before European settlement drove them away, this was home for thousands of different species. Now, the Melbourne and Metropolitan Board of Works is developing this area into a unique wildlife sanctuary and public park.
I think the great thing about them is that they bring wildlife into people, and also it's terrific to see what can be done in providing new habitats for these water birds.
Westgate Park is still in its formative stages, and it'll be 4 to 5 years before the shrubs and young trees are fully established. So far, few people are aware of its existence, but biologists like Richard Loyne are confident this will become an important part of Melbourne's recreational and natural landscape.
The ibis are breeding here, so do you see that as a vote of confidence in this
Certainly
environment?
Is. The ibis are breeding, and so are quite a lot of ducks and coot, and yes, absolutely. I think birds have a special fascination, partly because they do come into cities.
To most Melbourne people, Altona is simply an industrial skyline to the west of the city centre. But there's more to Altona than its petrochemical complexes.
They don't seem to be unduly disturbed by all the activity around, as long as there's habitat for them, as long as there are things to eat, and as long as they're not actually being molested. Oh, there's two flying straight towards us.
I see them, right, yes.
Dark red heads and long upturned beaks. That's an Australian breeding wader, and they nest mainly in temporary waters further inland from here. It's possible they could nest here, though. These are sharp-tailed sandpipers, which breed in the far north of Arctic Siberia, in the tundra, and come down here every year to Australia. They feed on small invertebrates which they find in the mud, and they're quite happy to use urban areas such as this, as long as there's a good food supply for them.
If they breed in Siberia, yet they spend half of their lives in Australia, are they Russian birds or Australian birds?
Well, I guess they were born in Russia, but they couldn't survive without Australia as well, and so you would have to say that they're both Russian and Australian.
It's thought these tiny birds take 3 weeks to reach Australia from Siberia, flying through the day and night with stopovers to refuel. They are just one of some 70 species of wading birds living here, either as full-time or part-time residents. It's no longer a case of the Russians are coming. These Soviet flyers have been travelling here for centuries.
This is the eastern tiger snake. It's widespread in southern Australia, and in Melbourne suburbs it's a lot more common than people might imagine.
If you leave snakes alone, they'll leave you alone.
Oh, that's true for sure. Yeah, they're very dangerous but very secretive.
With the arrival of spring and the warmer weather, tiger snakes are now particularly active.
They follow the Yarra Valley right along there. Abbotsford, Richmond, those areas are still along there.
Right into the centre of the city almost?
Almost, yeah.
Now this is pretty close to the heart of Melbourne, the training centre for Royal Guide Dogs on the banks of the Yarra at Kew. After losing a couple of dogs to tiger snakes, the school decided to fight back.
Instead of killing them outright, they've hired a semi-professional snake catcher to catch the snakes and transport them somewhere else where they're not going to be a problem. Their main food items are generally frogs, so anywhere where there's frogs in numbers, such as the river valleys, you're going to have snakes. You can see he's flicking a tongue in and out to see what's going on, tensing the muscles occasionally.
Why is he looking straight at me?
All reptiles are protected, although people do tend to kill first and ask questions later, which means that snake lookalikes, such as this legless lizard, are in the firing line.
I'm sure people don't realise that there are such things as legless lizards, and I'm sure that they get killed.
It's no wonder that blue-tongued lizards are often mistaken for tiger snakes. They may look fearsome, but they're harmless to humans.
They can bite, and it's quite a powerful bite, but they've just got a row of very blunt teeth that doesn't break the skin.
You find urban wildlife in the oddest of places. This is a favourite haunt for many reptiles. Here in Melbourne's General Cemetery, I'm told, live marbled geckos by the thousands.
Yeah, the natural habitat of these things is crevices in trees, under bark and under rocks and rock outcrops, so this mimics the natural environment very well. The caretaker says they get down these, hiding there. A bit cold for him to come out tonight, perhaps. See, it's got adhesive pads on the toes, crawls around the vertical surfaces, and these can even crawl up a pane of glass. This particular marbled gecko is the only one in southern Victoria, and it's nocturnal, very secretive. People would hardly ever come across them, and yet they're widespread throughout the suburbs.
Melbourne General Cemetery is not only home for geckos, it has, over the years, also been a refuge for possums and foxes, a haven for the living amid monuments to the dead. Eltham is one of those Melbourne suburbs that succeeds in striking a happy balance between city and country life. It's an ideal setting for a wildlife biologist to build his home. Step into Ian Temby's backyard and you're in a private wildlife sanctuary.
A lot of people like to see them around. Not so many people perhaps like to hear them screeching their heads off, but it's certainly nice to have them around, I think.
And Ian would rather see possums in his trees than in his roof.
By putting up hollows like this, there's a good chance of providing alternative accommodation so that they've got somewhere else to go.
At the bottom of Ian's garden, two eastern rosellas are raising a family. But, as is the case almost everywhere, these native animals and birds are not having it all their own way. The nesting boxes at the front of the house, set up to attract rosellas, have been taken over by two introduced species, starlings and miners. The miners simply toss the rosella's eggs onto the ground.
I saw them chasing the rosellas away. They also took over from the starlings, which were using the other hollow, and threw the starlings' babies out. So they're very aggressive birds.
Our native wildlife is also under threat from other introduced species. This was once a ringtail possum. Ian Temby believes it fell victim to a fox.
Most people living in the city don't realise just how common foxes are to the urban landscape. They're everywhere, really, aren't they?
They certainly are, yes, even right in the centre of the city, in the Botanic Gardens here in Melbourne, but right down the Yarra River. It's surprising how long they can be in an area with people just not being aware of their presence.
Under this house in the Melbourne suburb of Boronia live a pair of foxes and 4 cubs who venture out at dusk or early morning to stretch their legs. Even closer to the city centre on the Melbourne waterfront live at least 2 foxes who have become so tame they can be fed by hand.
Oh, that's lovely, isn't he? Got him begging and all.
Ian Temby also has little time for these urban dwellers.
In terms of predators, probably man's a greater threat, but if you discount man's activities, sure, I think cats would be the greatest threat. The real clue, I think, is to keep your cats indoors at night, particularly. I prefer to see some way of insisting that cats remain on the property of the owner, but that seems a bit difficult.
Put them on a leash.
Well, I know somebody who's done that. quite successfully. His cat seemed to be quite happy, and it was kept on a running lead.
Other introduced scourges are house mice and rats. They spoil huge amounts of food and spread disease. Unfortunately, there's little that can be done to rid ourselves of these unwelcome pests. They're now as much a part of our urban landscape as the brush-tailed possum, the cockatoos and the rosellas in Ian Temby's backyard.